You are not outside.
The Factor stood in the doorway of the trapping cabin and kept his scarf pressed against his face for a full minute before he trusted himself to step inside. He had worked for the Hudson's Bay Company for 19 years. He had processed furs in posts from James Bay to the Athabasca country, had ridden out 2 winters that killed lesser men, had once walked 40 miles on a broken snowshoe to report a fight at a trading post that had left 3 Métis traders dead and 1 company man missing. He was not a squeamish man. He was not a man who stood in doorways pressing scarves to his face as a general practice. But the smell coming from the interior of Cabin 7 of the Mackenzie River outpost was not a smell he had encountered before in 19 years of northern work, and he was a methodical enough man to acknowledge when something fell outside the boundaries of his experience. He stepped inside. The cabin was 16 by 20 feet, built of squared spruce timber with a single window facing south and a stone fireplace occupying the better part of the north wall. It had housed 3 men through the winter season, 2 trappers working the line and 1 company man responsible for record-keeping and supply. The fireplace was cold. The supply of firewood stacked against the east wall was untouched, which meant the fire had been out for some time before whatever happened had happened, which in February in the Mackenzie country meant the interior temperature had dropped to something indistinguishable from the exterior, which in February in the Mackenzie country meant somewhere around 40 below. Things preserved well at 40 below. This was something the Factor was aware of. It was the reason he could identify with more clarity than he would have preferred the nature of the objects arranged on the cabin's central table. He did not count them. He looked at them once long enough to understand what they were, and then he looked at the wall instead and breathed through his scarf, and gave himself 30 seconds to be a man who was processing something difficult, rather than a Factor with a job to complete. Then he turned back and completed his survey. The 3 bunks were empty and undisturbed. The supply chest was latched and full, which meant no one had eaten in some time before the end. The record book was open on the small writing desk in the corner. The last entry dated February 3rd, 1847, 2 months ago now. The door had been latched from the inside. The window shutter was intact and bolted. On the floor near the fireplace, someone had scraped marks into the wood with what appeared to be a knife blade. Not words. Not any alphabet the Factor could identify. Shapes. Repeated shapes spiraling inward from the edges of the scraped area toward a center point, growing smaller and more frantic as they approached the middle, and at the very center nothing, just a small scorched circle as though a candle had been held there until the wood caught and then extinguished before the fire could spread. The Factor picked up the record book and read the last entry. Then he read it again. Then he closed the book, put it inside his coat, and walked back outside into the clean, cold February air and stood there for some time with his face tilted up toward the gray sky. The 2 Cree guides who had brought him here were waiting with the wolves 100 yards back. They had not approached the cabin. He had noticed when they first came within sight of it that both men had stopped their dogs simultaneously and looked at each other in a way that communicated something the Factor was not privy to, and that the elder of the two, a man named Masqua, who had guided for the company for 11 years, and whom the factor trusted more than most men he had ever met, had spoken a single word in Cree that the factor did not know. He walked back to where they waited. "What did you find?" Masqua asked. His voice was even. His face gave nothing. "3 men are gone," the factor said. "No bodies, no sign of departure." Masqua nodded slowly as though this confirmed something rather than surprised him. "The record book," the factor said, holding it up. "The last man who wrote in it, a man named Elias Cord, left a considerable account. Several weeks of entries." He paused. "He describes something in the forest." Masqua was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should burn the cabin. The company will want an investigation." "Burn the cabin," Masqua said again, without heat, without insistence, simply as a man states a fact he has already determined. "And when you write your report, write what you need to write. But burn the cabin." The factor looked at the older man for a long moment. In 11 years, he had never heard Masqua give advice that turned out to be wrong. He sent back to the post for incendiary supplies. While he waited, he sat in the snow with his back against a spruce tree and read the record book from the beginning. It took him 2 hours. When he finished, the light had changed and his hands were very cold, and he sat for a while longer without moving, looking at the tree line, thinking about everything Elias Cord had written in those pages. Then he thought about the objects on the table. Then he stopped thinking about those and focused on the tree line instead, which was safer. When the incendiary supplies arrived, he supervised the burning himself. He stood in the snow and watched Cabin 7 of the Mackenzie River outpost burn until there was nothing left but a black scar in the white ground and a column of smoke rising into the gray February sky. Masqua stood beside him. Neither man spoke until the fire was done. "Will it be enough?" the factor asked finally. Masqua considered this with the same unhurried gravity he brought to all questions. "For now," he said, "it is patient. It has been here longer than patience has had a name." He watched the last of the smoke. "But you should tell your company to move its posts, all of them, away from the deep forest, away from the old ground." A pause. "They will not listen." "No," the factor agreed. "They will not." Masqua made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. "Then it will take more," he said simply, and he walked back to his dogs. The factor stood at the edge of the black scar for a moment longer. In his coat against his chest, he could feel the weight of the record book. The account of Elias Cord, company man formerly of Montreal, who had spent the winter of 1846 to 1847 in the deep Mackenzie country, and had written down in neat clerical handwriting that grew progressively less neat as the weeks passed, everything that had happened to him and to the 2 trappers in his charge. He should burn the book too. He knew that. Masqua would tell him to burn the book. He walked to his dogs instead, got on the sled, told his guide to take him back to the post. He kept the book. This is what it said. "My name is Elias Cord. I am 28 years old. I am employed by the Hudson's Bay Company as a post recorder and supply manager. Grade 3 assigned to the Mackenzie River District in the autumn of 1846. I am writing this account in the hope that someone will eventually find it and understand what has happened here, because I am increasingly of the opinion that I will not be leaving this cabin to explain it myself. But I am getting ahead of myself. I will start from the beginning, as my father always told me. A proper account should start even when the ending is already known. I arrived at Fort Providence on the Mackenzie River in September of 1846 on a supply canoe out of Fort Simpson, accompanied by the season's provisions and 2 trappers who had contracted with the company for the winter season. A man named Clarence Webb, 31, from New Brunswick, who had been trapping the northern country for 6 years, and who wore his experience in the economy of his movement and the flatness of his affect. And a man named Robert Ashford, 24, from somewhere in Ontario. He never specified with any precision for whom this was his 2nd season in the North. I will describe these men properly because they deserve to be described properly, and because what happened to them deserves a record that treats them as the men they were, rather than simply as men to whom things happened. Clarence Webb was quiet in the way that certain northern men are quiet, not from shyness or severity, but from a relationship with silence that most people raised in populated places never develop. He had been alone in the bush for extended periods, enough times that solitude had become a kind of native language for him, one he was more comfortable in than speech. He was not unfriendly. He taught me things without being asked to teach me things, the way a person with useful knowledge and no interest in withholding it simply shares it when the occasion arises. He showed me how to read weather in the quality of light on the horizon. He showed me how to move through deep snow without exhausting myself. He showed me which sounds the forest made that meant nothing, and which sounds warranted attention. And he did all of this without condescension, which I appreciated because I was a man from Montreal who had spent the previous 4 years behind a desk and had no illusions about the gap in practical knowledge between us. Robert Ashford was louder, younger, given to enthusiasms that Clarence regarded with tolerant amusement, and that I found at least initially a welcome counterweight to the pervasive gravity of the northern winter. He talked often about what he was going to do with his earnings, a farm somewhere in Upper Canada. A wife he had in mind, though had not yet proposed to a horse of a particular description that he had seen once at a market in Kingston and never stopped thinking about. He was good company around the fire in the evenings. He laughed easily. He had a gift for mimicry that he deployed to cheerful effect, and that even drew occasional reluctant smiles from Clarence. Fort Providence was a small post, a factor's house, a trading store, a warehouse, and a handful of outbuildings arranged around a central yard. The permanent staff was 6 men. The surrounding country was given over to the Dene, with whom the company maintained a working relationship of the kind that I had been trained to regard as mutually beneficial, and that over the course of the winter I came to understand with considerably more complexity. We spent our first 2 weeks at the fort acquiring our equipment and laying in supplies before setting out for the trap line that had been assigned to Clarence and Robert under their contract. The line was located roughly 40 miles northeast of the fort, running along the drainage of a creek that fed into the Mackenzie from the east through a country of black spruce and muskeg and beaver meadows that Clarence said had produced well in previous seasons. We established our base camp at the end of October, that is the cabin I am now writing from, and set up the line over the following 2 weeks. 14 trap stations, each roughly 2 miles apart, forming a rough oval through the best country. The early weeks were productive. Beaver, mink, some marten. Clarence ran the line with the efficiency of long practice. Robert with the enthusiasm of relative youth, and I kept the records, maintained the cabin, and learned as much as I could about a way of life that was entirely foreign to my previous experience. I was content. It would not be accurate to say I was happy. Precisely, the North in November does not easily accommodate happiness, which requires a certain openness to the world that the cold and the dark and the weight of the silence tend to compress. But I was engaged and purposeful and sleeping well and eating well, and I thought I had made a reasonable choice in accepting this posting. Then the animals stopped. It happened gradually enough that I might have missed it had I not been keeping records. But I was keeping records. It was, after all, my purpose, and so I noticed in the second week of November that the catch numbers had begun to decline. Not sharply, not dramatically, but consistently. A few fewer beaver. The mink stations coming up empty where they had been reliable. By the third week, the decline was pronounced enough that Clarence noticed it without my pointing it out. And that was saying something, because Clarence noticed things with a thoroughness that made most men's attention feel approximate. It happens, he said when I raised it one evening. Country gets hunted out. We'll shift the far end of the line east, try the new drainage. So we shifted the line, and for a few days the catch improved, and then it declined again, more sharply this time, and within a week the new stations were as empty as the old ones. Clarence said nothing for several days. He ran the line each morning without comment, came back each evening with the same spare acknowledgement of what the numbers were, ate his supper, smoked. His pipe, went to sleep. I had already learned enough about him to understand that this silence had a quality to it that Clarence's silences were not all the same, that there was a working silence and a resting silence and a thinking silence, and that what I was observing now was none of those. What I was observing was something that I did not have a word for yet. I found the word eventually. The word was unsettled. Robert noticed it too. Robert's response to the declining catch was the opposite of Clarence's. He talked more, not less, filling the evenings with an almost aggressive cheerfulness that I recognized even then as a man talking to keep something at bay. Early winter, Robert said one evening, dealing a hand of cards with exaggerated confidence. Happened to a fellow I know up on the Albany. Slow start then, the whole second half of the season made up for it. He came out with more marten than he could carry. He looked at Clarence expectantly. Clarence looked at his cards. Did this fellow say why it had been slow at the start weather, I suppose? Animals go deeper when it's cold. It hasn't been particularly cold, Clarence said. Well then, territory shift. Beaver move their lodges, everything else follows. Robert laid down a card with unnecessary force. There's always an explanation. Clarence looked at him for a moment. Yes, he said. There usually is. That was the first indication I had that Clarence already knew something was wrong and was deciding how much to say about it. I know that now. At the time, I simply noted the exchange and went on with the evening. The thing that changed my understanding came 4 days later. I had gone out along the south end of the line to check 3 stations that Clarence had not gotten to before the light failed. It was a clear day, cold and still, the spruce trees carrying their weight of snow with the dignified resignation of things that have been doing this for a very long time. I was not uneasy. I had been out on the line alone before, had developed a reasonable confidence in my navigation, and the south end was the most familiar stretch of the route. I checked the first 2 stations empty unsurprisingly and was working my way toward the third when I noticed the silence. I want to be precise about this because I think precision matters when the thing being described is easy to dismiss. The boreal forest in winter is not a noisy place. The ambient sound level is low. Wind in spruce boughs, the occasional creak of a frozen tree, the sound of your own movement through snow. What I noticed was not the absence of sound in the absolute sense. What I noticed was the absence of a specific category of sound, the small, intermittent, almost subliminal sounds of living things going about the business of being alive. The chickadee moving through a branch 10 yards away, the raven somewhere overhead, the whiskey jack that had been following me at a discreet distance since the second station. They were gone, all of them. And I had not noticed them leaving, which meant the departure had been gradual, which meant something had been quietly displacing the ambient life of the forest for some distance before I reached the point where I noticed their absence. I stood still for a moment and listened. The forest was not silent. There was a sound, very faint at the low edge of audibility and consistent in a way that natural sounds are not the irregular creak and settle of wind-loaded branches, not the unpatterned back and forth of weather working on wood, but a steady, low sound that I could feel as much as hear a sound that seemed to come from the ground itself or from something very close to the ground. I stood there for perhaps a minute. The sound neither increased nor diminished. Nothing moved in the trees around me. Then, from somewhere to my left and perhaps 60 yards distant, I heard something step through snow. One step, large, the compressed crunch of something heavy compacting the surface crust. Then nothing. I am not a brave man in the particular sense that word is often used. I don't have a taste for risk, don't seek out tests of physical courage, and in the 19 months since this posting I have never pretended otherwise. But I am a calm man. I can generally keep my head when my head needs keeping. So I will say that what I did next was not panic. It was a calculated assessment that whatever had made that sound was larger than anything I wanted to encounter alone at the south end of a trap line in the middle of the Mackenzie country, and that the calculated response was to return to the cabin by the most direct route available to me. I returned to the cabin. I told Clarence what I had heard. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he asked me 2 questions: which direction the sound had come from, and whether the low background sound had been present before or after I first noticed the absence of birds. Before, I said. I thought it had been present before, but I had not identified it as unusual until the birds were gone. Clarence nodded. He picked up his pipe and looked at it without lighting it. Then he looked at Robert, who was across the cabin and had gone very still during my account, and something passed between them that I was not privy to, some communication made of the specific quality of stillness and the specific angle of a look. "I need to tell you something," Clarence said, "both of you." He had heard the sound before. That was the first thing he said. 2 seasons ago, he told us, working a line on the upper Liard River, north and west of where we were now. He had been partnered that season with an older trapper named Gruel, a French-Canadian from Quebec, who had been working the northern country for 30 years, and who had, in Clarence's assessment, forgotten more about the bush than most men would ever know. The catch had declined the same way. The animals had gone first from the far end of the line, then progressively from the stations closer in a pattern that Gruel said he had seen once before, 20 years earlier on the Peace River. The sound had begun the same low sound, the same ground-level resonance about 2 weeks after the catch started falling off. "What did Gruel say it was?" I asked. Clarence was quiet for a moment. "He said the Dane called it the Old Forest," he said. "Not an animal, not a spirit exactly. Something between. Something that had been in the deep country before there were animals, before there were people, before there was anything that had a name for itself, or for anything else." He paused. "He said it slept most of the time. He said when it was asleep everything was normal good. Trapping animals present the forest the way a forest ought to be. He said it woke up sometimes. He didn't know what woke it. Maybe the season. Maybe the disturbance of the line. Maybe something else." Another pause. He said when it woke up, the country went wrong. "What happened on the Liard?" Robert asked. He had not moved from his bunk. "We pulled the line and left," Clarence said. "Left 3 weeks of trapping and rode out. Gruel said there was nothing else for it. Said you could wait it out or leave, but you couldn't face it because facing it was the wrong frame entirely, like trying to argue with the season." He turned the unlit pipe in his hands. "We got back to the fort, and Gruel told the factor that the country had been hunted out and we needed reassignment. Factor believed him, or pretended to. Gruel said company men always pretended to." A slight pause. "We were back out on a different line within a week. New country, no sound. Good catch the whole rest of the season." "And you didn't think to tell us this before we came out here?" Robert asked. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge under it. "It's rare," Clarence said. "In 6 years I saw it once on the Liard. Gruel saw it twice in 30 years. I didn't expect to see it again." He looked at Robert steadily. "I didn't think it was relevant to warn you about something with roughly the odds of a lightning strike. And now I think we should consider our options." The options as Clarence laid them out were 3. We could pull the line immediately and return to the fort, accepting the loss of the season's catch. We could wait to see whether the disturbance was temporary. Gruel had said, Clarence recalled, that it sometimes moved through an area over a period of weeks, and then shifted, and the country returned to normal. Or we could press on and attempt to complete the season, accepting the risk that the situation might worsen. "What does worsening look like?" I asked. Clarence thought about this for a longer time than I found comfortable. Gruel told me about the first time he had encountered it. He said, on the Peace River. He hadn't known what it was then. Stayed too long. He was with a man named Beauchamp. He set the pipe down. He buried Beauchamp near the river. He said Beauchamp went out to check the line one morning and didn't come back. And when Grue found him, Grue said he wasn't sure how to describe it. He said the word that kept coming to him was unmade. A pause, like something had decided Beauchamp was in the wrong place and had resolved the situation accordingly. The fire crackled. Outside the cabin, the wind was picking up, pressing against the walls with the patient, exploratory quality of wind that is looking for a way in. "We leave in the morning," Robert said. "It's 50 miles to the fort," Clarence said. "In this weather, 3 or 4 days. We cache the furs we have and come back for them in spring." "Fine. We leave in the morning." Clarence looked at me. I nodded. In the morning, Clarence agreed. In the morning, Robert's dogs were gone. I should explain the dogs. Each of us had a small team, 4 animals each, enough to pull a loaded sled on the main trail. We kept them in a lean-to attached to the back of the cabin, secured on a gang line, anchored to a heavy spruce log. 12 dogs on 3 gang lines behind a solid wall in a structure that had been standing through 3 previous winters without incident. In the morning, all 12 were gone. The gang lines were intact. The anchor log was in place. The lean-to was undamaged. There was no sign of the dogs having been disturbed. No blood, no struggle, no tracks leading away from the lean-to in any direction. 12 large sled dogs. Gone. We stood in the lean-to for some time without speaking. "The sound," I said finally. It had been present again last night. I had noticed it through the cabin wall, that low ground-level resonance, and had told myself it was the wind. "Yes," Clarence said. "Can it do that?" Robert's voice was very flat. "Take animals that are inside from a closed structure without leaving a mark." Clarence did not answer, which was an answer. We reassessed our options. Without dogs, we could not haul the sleds. We could travel on foot, which in the conditions would take 5 to 6 days, to reach the fort, possibly longer. We had sufficient provisions for 3 weeks. We had our rifles and adequate ammunition. Clarence's view was that we should leave immediately on foot, taking only what we could carry. Robert's view was the same. My view was the same. We packed our most essential gear, provisions, bedrolls, rifles, ammunition, my record book and writing materials, which I include here not out of vanity, but because it was these that preserved the account you are now reading, and we left the cabin at mid-morning. We made 8 miles the first day. Good progress given the conditions. We camped in a hollow where a deadfall spruce provided some windbreak. Built a fire, ate a hot meal, and sat with our backs to the log and our faces to the forest and took turns keeping watch through the night. The watch was my idea. Clarence did not argue with it. Nothing happened that first night. The sound was present at low intensity, the same ground-level resonance, and I had begun to understand from Clarence's description and from the 2 days of living with it that it was not a sound that a thing made exactly. It was more a sound that the thing's presence made the way ice makes sounds under its own pressure, not because it intends to, but because it cannot help it. It was the sound of something very large occupying space. The second day we made 12 miles. The weather was clear and cold, and the going was relatively firm, and we moved well, and Robert's mood improved with the movement and the sense of progress. And by the time we stopped for the evening, there was something approaching normalcy in the camp. The fire, the meal, the conversation. That wasn't conversation exactly, but was the comfortable exchange of practical information that substitutes for conversation among men of few words in difficult country. It was Robert who first noticed the tracks. We had stopped on a ridge overlooking a frozen lake, a good campsite open enough to see in 3 directions with a rock face to our north, providing shelter from the wind. Robert had gone to gather firewood from the tree line to the south and came back without it. "There are tracks," he said, "in the tree line, coming from the south." We went to look. The tracks were in the fresh snow that had fallen the previous night, which meant they were recent, within the last 12 hours at most. They were large. That is the word I keep coming back to, and I recognize its inadequacy, so let me be more specific. Each impression was roughly 3 feet in length and 2 feet in width, vaguely ovoid, depressed to a depth that suggested a weight I could not calculate. The stride between impressions was approximately 8 feet. They came from the south, from the direction we had been traveling, and they stopped at the edge of the tree line facing the ridge, facing our camp. They did not continue. They did not return. They stopped, and that was all. "It came from behind us," Robert said. "Yes," Clarence said, "which means it knows where we are." "Yes." Robert looked at the tracks for a while. Then he looked at the forest to the south, which was dark and still in the last of the afternoon light. "Will the fire help?" he asked. "I don't know," Clarence said. "Grue kept fires going. He said Beauchamp was caught without a fire. I don't know if that's cause and effect or coincidence. We keep the fire," I said. "We keep it large, and we keep it through the night." We kept it through the night. We did not sleep in shifts. None of us slept at all. We sat at the fire and kept it built up and listened to the forest and watched the tree line and said very little. The sound was stronger that night, closer. At 2 or 3 in the morning, in the period of stillest cold when the temperature dropped to its lowest, and the spruce trees cracked and popped with the contraction of their frozen wood, I heard something at the edge of the firelight's reach that I will describe here as accurately as I can. Breathing. Not frantic breathing, not the breathing of something excited or aggressive. Slow, deep, the measured respiration of something very large that was not particularly exerting itself. It came from approximately 30 feet south of the fire in the darkness beyond where the firelight died. I did not say anything. I looked at Clarence. He was looking at the same point in the darkness. His rifle was across his knees, and his hand was on the stock, but he had not raised it, and I understood, watching him, that raising it was not something he was going to do. Not because he lacked courage, but because Grue had told him something about the futility of that gesture that had lodged deeply enough to govern his instincts even now. The breathing continued for perhaps 10 minutes. Then it stopped. Not gradually, simply stopped between one breath and the next, as though a decision had been made and the matter concluded. The sound in the ground faded slightly. We did not speak about it until morning. Robert changed after that night. I do not mean he changed dramatically or suddenly. I mean that over the following day of travel, I noticed things about his behavior that I catalogued one by one as they occurred, and that in retrospect, writing this account weeks later, form a pattern I recognize with the sick clarity of hindsight. He became quieter. Robert, who had talked continuously since I had known him, who had filled every available silence with the easy chatter of a sociable man. Robert went quiet in a way that was completely unlike him, a silence that had none of Clarence's settled quality, none of the peace of a man comfortable in his own company. This was a silence with a pressure behind it, the silence of a man in whom something had changed, orientation, and had not yet finished changing. He ate less. Not dramatically, not enough on a day of hard travel to raise immediate alarm. But I noticed keeping the cook fire that evening that he left half his meal untouched, and didn't seem to register that he had done so. He stopped looking south. This was the detail that I kept returning to as I wrote this account. We had been looking south all day. South was the direction of travel. South was the direction of safety, and more practically south was the direction the tracks had come from, which meant south was the direction requiring vigilance. Clarence and I both kept our eyes moving south at regular intervals. Robert did not. Robert's gaze had settled northward, back the way we had come back toward the deep country and the trap line and the cabin we had left. And when I saw him doing it the third time, I felt something drop through the floor of my stomach that I did not immediately have a name for. That evening I told Clarence what I had observed. I waited until Robert had gone a short distance to make water and spoke quietly and quickly. Clarence listened. He did not look surprised. He looked, if anything, like a man who has been expecting a piece of news that he had hoped would not arrive. Gruel described this, he said. Not clearly, he said Beauchamp started looking back at the country 2 days before he went out on the line and didn't come back. He looked at the fire. Gruel said it was like watching a man start listening to a sound only he could hear. What do? We keep moving. We stay together. We keep him talking, keep him engaged, keep him south-facing as much as we can. He paused. And tonight we don't let him take a watch alone. I nodded. Clarence, I said, the tracks this morning. We've been moving all day. Do you think? Yes, he said. I think it's been following us. We had not spoken about this openly, and I had been managing my understanding of it in the same way one manages a serious injury in the field. Keep pressure on it. Don't look at it directly. Keep moving. Having Clarence confirm it aloud was its own particular kind of cold. Robert came back to the fire. Clarence began talking to him about the route for tomorrow, about the post at Fort Providence, about Robert's farm in Upper Canada, drawing him out with the patient, deliberate intention of a man trying to keep a fire lit in wet weather. Robert responded slowly at first, and then with something more like his normal self. And for an hour around the fire, it almost felt like the second week of the season, when everything was straightforward and the catch was good and the North was just the North, magnificent and cold and comprehensible. Then Robert fell asleep by the fire, which was unusual for him, and Clarence and I looked at each other over his sleeping body, and I saw in Clarence's face something I had not seen there before. Fear, not panic, not the open face of a man losing control. Clarence was too composed for that. But the particular flat tightness around his eyes of a man who has assessed his situation honestly and found the assessment to be bad. What happened to Beauchamp exactly? I asked very quietly. Clarence was quiet for a long time. The fire worked at its wood. Robert breathed with the slow regularity of deep sleep. Gruel said he woke in the night to find Beauchamp's bedroll empty, Clarence said at last. He went out looking for him. Found him about half a mile from camp, standing in the open. No coat, no rifle, nothing. Just standing. A pause. Gruel called to him. Beauchamp turned around. Gruel said his face. He stopped. He picked up a stick and turned it in his hands. He said his face was wrong. Not injured, not frightened. Just wrong. Like a map of something that wasn't there anymore. And then Gru ran. He said the sound went through him then, not from outside, but from inside, like it had been in him all along, and had just now decided to make itself known. He ran back to camp and packed and rode out, and he didn't stop for 18 hours. Clarence put the stick down. He went back in the spring to bury Beauchamp properly with another man. He said when they found the body he said the word he kept using was scattered, as though something had decided the physical coherence of the thing was unnecessary and had undone it the way you'd unravel a knot. I sat with this. He said Clarence continued very quietly that what he understood afterward, what 20 years of thinking about it had given him, was that the thing didn't want them dead. He said wanting anything was too human a concept to apply to it. He said it was more like when you're walking through brush and your coat gets caught on a branch. The branch doesn't want to stop you. It isn't hostile. You've simply got entangled in something that has its own nature, and that nature is indifferent to yours, and the untangling is not gentle. Robert made a sound in his sleep. We both looked at him. His eyes were moving under his closed lids. His lips were moving slightly. The fire's light played across his face, and I watched it for some time and tried to find in it the cheerful young man who had talked about his horse in Kingston with such specific and unreasonable affection, and I found him barely at the corners of his mouth, and the set of his brow found the ghost of him, the residue of him, and I was afraid. He was gone on the 4th morning. We had kept watch in pairs, Clarence and I, trading off sleep in 2-hour increments, while one of us always remained awake, and one hand always rested on Robert's shoulder, to wake us if he moved. I had the watch from 3 to 5, and Clarence had taken it from 5, and when I woke at 7 in the thin gray light of the northern dawn, Robert was not in his bedroll, and Clarence was sitting at the cold fire, with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. I said his name. He looked up. When I asked, "I don't know," he said. His voice had something in it I had not heard from him before. A roughness. I was watching him. And then I looked at the tree line, and when I looked back he stopped. "North?" I asked. "The tracks go north." I looked north. I looked at the tracks Robert's boots had made in the snow, heading back the way we had come back toward the deep country, back toward the Sound. They were clear and distinct in the new snow, and they moved with the directness of a man who knows exactly where he is going. Clarence stood up. He stood very straight, the way men stand when they are deciding something that they do not want to decide. "If we follow him," I said. "I know." Gruel said, "I know what Gruel said." He looked at the tracks. He looked at them for a long time. Robert's tracks going north into the deep country in no coat with nothing. He's been gone at most 2 hours. "If we move fast, Clarence." He looked at me. "He went because he wanted to," I said. It cost me something to say it. Last night, his face. Whatever was happening to him, he wasn't fighting it anymore. Clarence stood very still. He was talking about the horse, he said finally, last night before he fell asleep. He was talking about the horse in Kingston. He blinked once. He described its color, said it was the color of a new penny. A pause. He hadn't talked about that horse in 2 weeks. We stood at the cold camp and looked at the tracks going north until the light was fully up and the decision had made itself in the way that decisions sometimes do not through resolution but through the simple passage of the moment in which another choice was possible. "We go south," I said. "We go south," Clarence agreed. We went south. We made the fort on the 6th day. I will not detail those final 2 days extensively, because the relevant facts are these: we moved fast. We kept fires at night, and the sound was with us the whole way, sometimes close, sometimes barely perceptible, but present constant, the low ground-level resonance of something very large occupying the space we were moving through. We heard the breathing again once on the 5th night from farther away than before, as though whatever it was had satisfied itself with Robert and had retreated to some deeper patience. The tracks, when we saw them, which was twice, were to the east of us and not approaching. We arrived at Fort Providence in poor condition. Frostbitten, exhausted, 14 days' worth of toll written in both our faces. The factor, a man named Holloway, met us in the yard and looked at us and looked behind us for Robert and asked us what had happened. Clarence told him that Ashford had become separated from us in a whiteout on the 2nd day of travel, and that despite searching we had been unable to locate him and were forced to assume he had perished. He told this lie with the same flat economy he brought to true statements, and Holloway believed it or appeared to, which in the Mackenzie country in 1847 was close enough to the same thing. Holloway assigned us a bunk in the barracks and said there would be an inquiry and we should rest first. I went to the barracks and I lay down on the bunk and I pulled the blanket up and I lay there with my eyes open and listened to the sounds of the fort, the fire in the hearth, the wind outside, the sound of men moving and talking and going about the ordinary business of their lives, and I tried to locate in myself whatever Beauchamp had found in the sound that had been worth walking north for. I could not find it. I am glad I could not find it. I am writing this account in the barracks at Fort Providence in the lamplight, 2 days after our return. Clarence is asleep across the room. Outside, the wind is doing what the wind does. The sound, the ground-level sound, the old sound, the sound that has no name in any language I know, is not present here. I do not know if this means the distance is sufficient, or if it means that the deep country and what lives in it have no interest in the post, in the cleared ground, in the spaces where men have built their fires and their certainties against the dark. I think it is the latter. I think what lives in the deep forest has always been there, and will always be there, and has no particular feeling about the men who move through its edges, except in the way a river has feelings about the sticks that fall into it. Not hostility, not curiosity, simply the indifferent application of a nature too large and too old to have learned the concept of exception. Robert Ashford walked north because something in him responded to that nature in a way that he could not resist, and perhaps in the end did not want to resist. I do not know what that means about Robert, and I have thought about it every hour of the 2 days since we returned, whether it was weakness or some other thing, whether the horse colored like a new penny was the last thing he was, or whether there was a moment in the deep country in the Sound when he found something he had been moving toward his whole life without knowing it. I hope there was such a moment. I hope very much that there was. Tomorrow, Clarence and I will speak to Holloway about our reassignment. We will recommend to whoever will listen that the trap line on the Mackenzie Creek drainage be retired and the territory left to itself. We will not explain our reasons with any completeness. The reasons are not the kind that fit in a company report. I am 28 years old. I am employed by the Hudson's Bay Company as a post recorder and supply manager, grade 3. I am from Montreal. My father was a fisherman. I have written this account so that it exists, so that what happened to Robert Ashford exists on paper under a name in a form that someone might someday find and read and understand. The company will write him off as lost to weather and the North, which is true in its way and insufficient in every other. His name was Robert Ashford. He was 24 years old. He talked about a farm and a woman he intended to marry and a horse the color of a new penny that he had seen once at a market in Kingston, Ontario, and never stopped thinking about. He deserved better than the North gave him. They all do. E. Cord, Fort Providence, April 1847. The factor closed the record book. Outside the window of his office, the last light was leaving the sky over the Mackenzie, the western horizon, going from orange to the deep luminous blue that precedes full dark in the northern spring. Somewhere across the river, a loon called once and was silent. He sat for a while with the book in his hands. Then he opened his bottom drawer, took out the cognac he kept there for exceptional occasions, and poured himself a measure that was considerably larger than exceptional occasions usually warranted. He drank it. He poured another. He thought about Masqua's advice. Burn the cabin. Move the posts. All of them, away from the deep forest, away from the old ground. He thought about the 32 figures on the table in the cabin, the objects he had not counted, the marks scraped in the floor. The green spell under the death smell ancient and settled and entirely indifferent. He thought about a young man named Robert Ashford who had walked north into the deep country with no coat and no rifle and apparently no resistance left. He thought about the old man at the tree line, the grief on his face. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not the satisfaction of an enemy watching a lesson land. Grief, the grief of a man who has watched this happen before and will watch it happen again, and knows that the watching is the only thing left to him, that the warning was given and not taken, that this is the shape of the thing, that this has always been the shape of the thing. The factor put Elias Cord's record book in the bottom drawer under the cognac bottle. He picked up his pen. He wrote his report. He wrote, Camp Bellerose lost to hostile action. Guerrilla activity. No survivors. Territory no longer viable for company operations. Recommend permanent withdrawal from the Mackenzie Creek drainage. He put down his pen. He read what he had written. He added in smaller letters at the bottom of the page the only true thing the report contained. The land is not ours. It was never ours. We borrowed it from something that did not know it was lending. He folded the report. He did not cross out the last line. He left it. In the morning, he sent a letter to the district superintendent recommending the permanent closure of the northeastern trap lines. The superintendent replied 6 weeks later that the territory was commercially viable and that the recommendation was declined. The factor read the reply. He read it twice. He folded it and put it in his bottom drawer next to the record book and the cognac. He poured himself a drink. He thought about Masqua's last words. They will not listen. Then it will take more. He drank his drink. Outside the window, the Mackenzie River moved south toward the sea, carrying with it the snowmelt of 1,000 miles of country. And in the country, the old ground lay under the spring sun, and the sound moved through it. The way blood moves through a body, quietly, constantly, without intention and without rest. The sound of something alive that has been alive since before alive, had a word waiting in the deep forest for the next man who would walk its edges and hear in the low resonance of the ground beneath his feet something that sounded like an answer to a question he had never known he was asking. The Mackenzie Creek trap line was reopened in the spring of 1848. 5 men were contracted for the season. None returned. The territory was closed permanently in 1849. No official explanation was recorded.